Hello everyone, thank you for joining our virtual presentation in our market outlook. My name is Bradyn Neises and I will be presenting on the land market here in our Sioux Falls area. We always start our presentation discussing the unimproved or bulk land transactions. This is large tracts of land purchased for the purpose of development. Let's take a look at the scoreboard. This graph represents the number of transactions that have taken place all the way back to 2009. The past 5 years have been very consistent with 6 to 8 transactions, 2020 being no different with 7. Let's take a look at the map. In this map, the colored pins represent the historic transactions dating back to 2012. In the white boxes, this is the 2020 transactions. Now there's 2 things I want to point out and discuss in further detail. The first being the top line of each white box. That represents the number of acres that were purchased in each transaction. 45 being the largest, 15 being the smallest, with an average of just 26 acres per transaction, which is a relatively small number compared to the past. We'll talk about this a little bit more coming up. The second thing I want to point out is the number on the bottom. That is the price point for each transaction. And looking at this, you can really categorize these transactions into 2 categories. Our traditional and our non-traditional sales. Let's break these up and talk about them a little bit deeper. These transactions we would categorize as our traditional transactions with the price point of about 20,000 acres or $20,000 per acre all the way up to about $47,000 per acre, which is what we typically see. Just to highlight one of them, 21 acres purchased at $47,000 an acre. This was a good development out at Arbor's Edge, overlooking the 13th tee box at the Willow Run golf course. Let's take a look at our non-traditional sales, or our infill sites. Starting at the top, this is the old Gage Brothers site, purchased by a local developer with the goal of a commercial redevelopment. Because he purchased the large tract of land and breaking it down into commercial lots, we kept it here in our unimproved land transactions. Price point, really $3.90 a square foot. Let's go down south to 41st and T. Ellis. This is 21 acres, it's the old Ulrich farm. This is a situation where it was ag land outside of the city limits. A buyer could come in and purchase this land at a relatively low risk, because the development happening all the way around it and infrastructure being low cost to the site. And they could develop it rather quickly. Heading over to the east side, 15 acres. This is the exact same situation. Development happening all the way around this. A buyer purchased, brought it into the city, and developed it right away. Price point for both of those, $3.50 a square foot. So what does this all mean for 2020, what happened in 2020, and what could happen in 2021? Well, what we saw is developers really taking a wait and see strategy. 2020 obviously brought a lot of unknowns into our market, and it was really difficult to take on the risk of those large transactions that we typically see each year, which is why we saw that average number a lot lower than what we typically see. However, if we look at it, or look at the other side of it, developers were really busy coming into the year with land they already owned in 2020. If you drive up Highway 100 or Veterans Parkway, almost 300 acres were being prepped and developed for lots for just this year. And so developers were busy, and with the amount of risk that happened or was there in 21, we didn't see those transactions like we typically do. So what does this look like for 2021? Well, we wanted to dig in and get some more data. So we created this graph here. This graph represents the number of acres that were purchased versus the number of transactions that took place. Obviously 2015 stands out. This was the Development Foundation purchasing all their land for Foundation Park. What I want to look at is that every other year pattern that comes out. 2019 being a big year, and then 2020 dropping down, under 200 acres. So if this pattern remains, or if the history repeats itself, 2021 is going to be a big year. I predict over 500 acres being purchased in the year 2021. Now, I believe that for a number of reasons, but just to name a few. Number one, the Sioux Falls economy has remained resilient, and I think my colleagues will attest to that as well. Number two, migration. South Dakota is fourth in the nation in people migrating into our state, which is keeping our population growth really strong. And third and last, inventory of housing. Ask any residential agent and they're begging for more inventory for their buyers. So where are all these transactions going to take place? I'm going to highlight a few areas where I think it could. Number one being Northwest Sioux Falls. Foundation Park has announced 2 large employers that are coming into the northwest sector of Sioux Falls. And Rob's going to talk more about that, but that could increase the demand up there in Northwest Sioux Falls. Jefferson High School, finally going to ring the bells in the fall, bringing a lot of activity out to Northwest Sioux Falls. And then finally the upside, there's not a lot of large-scale developments happening in the Northwest Sioux Falls currently. Also, Eastside Sioux Falls along the Highway 100 or Veterans Parkway corridor. Going to be development happening there. And finally, we've been tracking Harrisburg for a couple of years, but 2021 could be the final, or could be the year that they finally start seeing activity with their trunk line in the ground and coming on service here shortly. That concludes my bulk land transaction presentation. Let's move on to improved land sales. After the bulk land is purchased, the developer does the dirt work, adds curb and gutter, utilities and water, and they break those large tracts of land into smaller parcels and sell them on a per square foot basis. Let's take a look at the scoreboard. Obviously, we had a great year in 2020 with 63 transactions and over $40 million in sales volume. I'll also note this graph represents or includes our neighboring communities of T, Harrisburg, and Brandon as well. Let's break these down into different asset classes. You can see each asset had a better year than the previous year in 2019, with industrial having a monstrous year with 33 transactions. Now I'm going to let my colleagues talk about their respected asset class and why we saw positive in each one. What I want to focus on is where these transactions took place and the trend that we're seeing. This aerial shows where the future South Dakota Highway 100 is going to be. And kudos to the leadership of Sioux Falls and the state of South Dakota for securing the funding and getting this project on the way to be completed in the next 5 to 6 years, which will have a huge economic impact for this area. In Sioux Falls, we see a high concentration of sales along the corridor. What I want to point out is T and Harrisburg. If we add up all those transactions, they equate for almost 40% of all the transactions that we had in our market, which is an interesting trend and one we'll continue to follow. So let's take a look at pricing. Now there's a large delta between the low and the highs in each category, and that's primarily due to the location and the development challenges or lack thereof. What I want to focus in on is on the right side of the screen, be it where the means of the 2019 and 2020. Starting at retail at the top, we saw over a $2 reduction in price in the mean. That's primarily due to seeing those transactions with the high dollar amount, with high risk and high reward, not being purchased like we've seen in previous years. Office has historically been consistent in our market, no different in 2020. Industrial, we saw a large demand and large amount of sales in industrial, so we saw that price raising up. I'll also note that the Development Foundation, who typically sets the bar for industrial pricing, has raised their prices the first time in a long time. And then finally, multifamily, again, demand is high and vacancy is low, so the pricing is going up. So let's take a look at my predictions. Unimproved land, I mentioned it before, but I see that our market's going to be up in unimproved land, primarily in the acres that will be sold in 2021. Improved land sales, industrial, again, I think there's going to be a high demand in industrial and it's going to continue to be strong. So I'm going to put it at level with our historic year that we had last year. Retail, again, a lot of risk and a lot of unknown in retail. I predict that it's going to go down. Office, if it remains consistent like it historically has, I'm going to continue to look at it to be consistent. And then finally, multifamily. The demand is there and the vacancy has been low. And as people migrate to Sioux Falls, this could be a reason for developers to look at more multifamily sites. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time and viewing our virtual presentation this year. We look forward to seeing you next year in person. Thank you.